First story, The Fog on Black Hollow Road. It was a cold November night when I found myself driving down Black Hollow Road, a desolate stretch of forest in northern Vermont. The radio played soft static, a faint echo of stations I could no longer reach. The road was empty, and the trees loomed like shadowy sentinels on either side. Suddenly, a thick fog descended without warning. It was so dense that I could barely see the hood of my car. The headlights seemed to bounce off the mist, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or a distant hoot of an owl. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a child wearing a simple white dress. Her hair was dark, and she stood perfectly still. Slammed on the brakes and came to a stop just a few feet away. I rolled down my window and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She did not respond. Instead, she slowly lifted her arm and pointed toward the trees. The fog seemed to thicken around her, and for a moment, thought I saw shadows moving among the trees. Against my better judgment, I stepped out of the car. The air was icy, and the fog swirled around me like living thing. "Where are your parents?" I asked, but the child remained silent. She turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the mist. I hesitated, but something compelled me to follow. I left the car running and stepped into the trees. The fog wrapped around me, and the world grew eerily quiet. I could barely see my own hands in front of me. Then I heard it, a low whisper that seemed to come from all directions. It wasn't words, but a soft, insistent murmur that made my skin crawl. I called out for the child, but my voice sounded small and distant. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the whispering grew louder. Shapes moved in the corner of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Suddenly, stumbled into a clearing. In the center was the child, her back to me. She was standing in front of an old wooden door that stood alone, with no walls or building to support it. The door was ajar, and a dim red light glowed from within. "Don't go in," I said, but my voice was barely a whisper now. The child turned to face me, and I realized her eyes were completely black. She smiled coldly and stepped through the door. The fog closed in, and the red light faded away. I was left alone in the clearing with no sign of the door or the child. Panicked, I ran back to my car. But when I reached the road, my car was gone. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. All I know is that Black Hollow Road is a place I will never drive again. Second story, The Fog of Briarwood. It was a chilly October night when I first arrived in Briarwood, a secluded village nestled deep in the forests of Maine. The air was thick with fog, rolling through the streets like an unseen force determined to consume everything in its path. I was visiting my cousin, Evan, who had moved there a year ago to escape the chaos of city life. Evan had always been a bit of a dreamer, and when he invited me to experience the tranquility of Briarwood, I agreed without hesitation. But the moment I stepped into the village, I felt something was off. The streets were empty, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the low howl of the wind. That night, Evan and I sat by the fireplace in his old wooden cabin. He spoke about the strange occurrences that had become part of life in Briarwood. "It's the fog," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It brings them out." When I asked who them was, he just shook his head and refused to say more. The next day, I decided to explore the village on my own. The fog seemed to follow me wherever I went, thickening until I could barely see a few feet ahead. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a stone altar at its center. The air was icy cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I noticed the strange markings etched into the altar. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper behind me. "Go back." I spun around but saw nothing but fog. The whispering grew louder and more insistent. "Leave this place." Terrified, I ran back to the village as fast as I could. That night, Evan was gone, his bed was empty, and his jacket was missing. I searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but found no trace of him. The fog seemed to mock me, its tendrils wrapping around me like a cold, unforgiving embrace. As dawn broke, I packed my things and left Briarwood without looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened to Evan, but I can still hear the whispers in my dreams. Go back. Third story, The Mist of Hollow Creek. It was a chilly October night when I first arrived in Hollow Creek, a small village nestled deep in the forests of Maine. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I was visiting my Aunt Claire, who had lived there her entire life. But my arrival was clouded by her strange warnings over the phone. "Don't go near the fog, Ethan," she had said, her voice trembling. "Stay indoors at night, no matter what you hear." I thought she was just being superstitious. But when I stepped into her home and saw her pale face, I realized she was genuinely terrified. Later, that evening, as I unpacked my bags in the guest room, I noticed a faint white mist seeping through the trees outside the window. The fog seemed to move with a purpose, curling and twisting like it was alive. I shut the curtains and tried to push the image out of my mind. Around midnight, heard a child's laughter echoing through the village. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, closer. I peered through the curtains and saw a young boy standing in the fog. He couldn't have been older than 10. He waved at me, his smile eerily bright in the dim light. "Who are you?" I called out softly. But the boy did not respond. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the dense woods. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and followed him. The fog grew thicker as I ventured deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches gnarled and twisting like skeletal fingers. Could barely see a few feet ahead of me. But I could still hear the boys' laughter, guiding me deeper and deeper into the mist. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and I found myself standing in a small clearing. In the center was an old, rotting well. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. The fog around me swirled and coalesced, forming the shape of a woman. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth a gaping black void. She pointed at the well and whispered, "He's down there. He always has been. Bring him home, or you'll join him." Her voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, and it left a cold ache in my chest. I stumbled back and ran blindly through the fog, not caring which direction I went. When I finally emerged from the forest, my aunt was waiting for me on the porch. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded, too shaken to speak. They say the fog takes what it wants, and it never gives them back, but sometimes it sends them to call others. You must leave tomorrow. Ethan, the fog has marked you. I left Hollow Creek at first light, but the memory of that night haunts me still. Sometimes, when the mist rolls in during autumn evenings, I hear the laughter of a boy echoing in the distance, and I know the fog is waiting for me to return.